I'm a PlayStation fan, mainly a fan of the classic Sony PlayStation era, from the original PlayStation to the PS3. I think the PS4 was the low point for Sony and PlayStation. That machine is horrible. I must admit that the DualShock 4 is the best controller ever made though. So there's that one thing I love about that generation. For the duration of this video, I'll be delving into the world of the original PlayStation system from Sony, also known as PS1 or even PSX if you prefer, and why I'm such a big fan of the system. I understand that the PSX acronym can be confusing nowadays, especially with Sony's release of the PS2 DVR system in Japan. However, it's important to note that the PlayStation was commonly referred as PSX back in the day by players and game journalists. After all, PSX was the codename for PlayStation during its development. I consider the PlayStation the best classic game console of all time. But why, you ask? Why not a Nintendo or Sega system like the SNES or Mega Drive? That's a good question, and I think it has to do with the timing of the PlayStation, when it came out, when I got one back in the day, and how old I was at the time. The PlayStation was far from the first video game system I had the pleasure of having at home. That was the Commodore 64 home computer. After that, NES, then Sega Mega Drive or Genesis, the Amiga 500 computer, and only after that, Sony PlayStation. So, what made the PlayStation so special to me? I was 12 when my brother and I had PlayStation for Christmas 1996 or November 1996 because we couldn't wait that 1 month. We had to have it right there, so our parents caved in. So, I was a teenager. Of course, my taste in video games started to shift from more family-friendly stuff, right? We played Mortal Kombat 2, Doom and other things like that before getting to PlayStation. Anyway, PlayStation had more of the kind of games I was really interested in than the competition. Sure, I liked playing Mario 64, Star Fox 64 or Lylat Wars, as it was known here, and 007 GoldenEye on N64. GoldenEye was right up my alley, but PlayStation offered way more games I wanted to play, like Die Hard Trilogy, one of my top 10 games ever, but I'll get to the games later in the video. So, I'd say I was at the right age when the PlayStation came around. If I were 10 years older, I'd probably prefer the Mega Drive or SNES over the PlayStation, or later Sega consoles like Saturn or Dreamcast. If I had gotten to enjoy Sega arcade games in arcades when I was teenager or young adult. I was too young for that, and I always lived where there were no such places anywhere near me. I have split gaming eras into two categories, my childhood and adulthood. This split goes right between 16-bit and 32-bit eras, in other words between SNES/Mega Drive and PlayStation. I grew up to adulthood with the PS1 and other PlayStation systems, the original being the most impactful to my life, with games like Metal Gear Solid, Gran Turismo and Final Fantasy VII. Let's talk about some of the most impactful games on the PlayStation for me. These games made me a PlayStation fan back then, and even some I've just discovered recently that cement my love for this system. Of course, I won't talk about all the games I got to experience because this video would be 3 hours long. Maybe you'd like that, let me know in the comments if you would. When talking about the original PlayStation, the first game that comes to mind is the Hideo Kojima epic from 1998, Metal Gear Solid. It offers masterful level of stealth action gameplay, and nothing comes even close to this from the era. MGS is an excellent blend of cinematic storytelling and great characters. I even had Solid Snake cut out from some gaming magazine plastered on my PC back then. Another Kojima epic is the interactive cinema-type game Polish Knots, which is in the same genre as Snatcher before it. Admittedly, it has very little actual gameplay, it's just a crosshair shooter on static screens, but it's still fun. You really play Polish Knots for the story and characters, not some action gameplay. The game was officially only released in Japan. I'm using a fan translation here, as you should if you want to play it and don't understand Japanese. From now on, I will separate games by genre, so if you don't want to hear about racing or sports games, you can skip them. Of course, I'd prefer it if you watch the whole thing. Thank you for your support. I played many JRPGs back then, but not so much anymore because I don't have the time to commit to them. Naturally, Final Fantasy VII is a killer app for the PS1, and of course it was one of the games I played the most back then. The fun story about that game is that the day it came out, I just got some detention that day in school, and I was put to clean the floor of the dining room of my school after classes. It was the most extended hour in my life. Probably because I knew that was the day Final Fantasy VII would be waiting for me when I got home. It was, and I never forget how I lost that 1 hour. I could have been playing the most anticipated game ever, and I had to spend it scrubbing the floor at my school instead. Other JRPGs worth mentioning are Konami RPGs, Suikoden and Vandal Hearts. I played Suikoden games a lot, especially the first one. Vandal Hearts is more of a strategy-oriented ordeal. I like that red stuff showering out of enemies, another indicator that my taste in games was already very mature at the time, in 1997. I enjoy spectating motorsports in real life, so it probably doesn't come as a surprise that I like racing games. When Gran Turismo hit the scene, it blew my mind. I classify racing games into two categories, before and after Gran Turismo. Back then, nothing could compete with it. Nowadays, when I have rediscovered how fun arcade games can be, I also play other type of racing games. The most known arcade racing game franchise on the PS1 is Ridge Racer series. I played the original in our community center before having the PlayStation at home. When we finally got our own, one of our first games was Ridge Racer Revolution, which was only a revised version of the original.
Rage Racer.
I also played Rage Racer a lot back then, and even if it looks little crap compared to other games in the series on PS1, I think it's worth the sequel.
3 laps to go.
Type 4 is a more recent experience for me. Objectively, it's the best one on the system. And when I say more recent, I still mean at least a decade, in 2024. Gran Turismo 2, the PS1 sequel, is probably one of the best racing games ever made, and my all-time favorite. Yes, I like it even more than GT games on PS2. Gran Turismo 2 is a perfect blend of arcade and simulation racing. If Gran Turismo 3 had the same amount of content, it would be the king of racing games. GT4 got a little too serious, and some of the fun factor was lost. One of the more realistic racing games my brother and I played a lot before Gran Turismo was a Psygnosis published licensed F1 game creatively named Formula 1. It's like all other games named football, boxing, etc.
Into the penultimate lap.
Other racing games worth briefly mentioning are Destruction Derby 2, which I loved, and Wipeout 2097, also known as Wipeout XL. In both cases, the sequel was better in every conceivable way. I can't go back to those originals even though I played them as well back in the day, at least the demo versions.
What's a man gotta do to get that kind of attention from you?
PlayStation has many action and adventure games to choose from, but to nobody's surprise, I will talk about Tomb Raider games. Even though we all know how the first game in the series was initially developed for Sega Saturn, PlayStation put the game on the map and made it pop culture phenomenon. I played the first 3 back then, but I don't think I actually finished any of them. I recall them being quite challenging, but still fun. And of course, Lara Croft made my socks whirl in my shoes. Having beautiful things to look at always helps overcome challenges. I actually own the whole PS1 Tomb Raider set these days physically. Some other action or adventure games I have discovered more recently are this fantastic Ghost in the Shell action game, in which you pilot a Tachikoma, a little walking one-person tank from that universe. Again, it's a challenging game, but fun, and the music is pumping. It's must play if you are a Ghost in the Shell fan. I have to mention Fighting Force briefly. Even though it's a beat 'em up game, I cram it into this category because it's an action game as well, isn't it? Fighting Force represents that rare breed of 3D beat 'em up game from the era. It's not perfect by any means, but I really enjoyed playing back then, and even now to some extent. This core design developed game was supposed to be Streets of Rage 4 if Sega had accepted Core's proposal, but they denied it. As a result, we have the Fighting Force, which was released everywhere except Sega's platform. Good job, Sega! One more action game I want to mention is one of my all-time favorite PlayStation games, if not games ever. Rope Entertainment developed Die Hard Trilogy by Fox Interactive in late 1996. 2/3 of this game is excellent. Die Hard Trilogy, as the name implies, is 3-in-1 game that has a different game for all 3 movies from back then. The first game is a third-person shooter, which is fine. The second game is an arcade-type rail shooter where you control only the crosshairs, and I love it. The third game is mediocre car driving game where you defuse bombs with a strict time limit. We used to dual-wield the rail shooter game with my friend back in the day, so the other player moved crosshairs and the other one did the shooting part. It was surprisingly fun. Using an emulator is the best way to enjoy this game today. Run the game at higher resolution with graphical improvements and overclocking the virtual PS1 CPU enough to make it a smooth 60 FPS experience like I'm running here. Yes, I created my own genre out of Resident Evil, but I mean the type of game of that era with 3D characters and enemies on top of pre-rendered 2D backgrounds, although sometimes they could have been real-time 3D like in the first Dino Crisis. This makes it an awesome looking game these days when running it at high resolution on an emulator.
Albert Wesker.
There are 3 mainline games in the Resident Evil series on PS1, and I like all of them. Objectively, Resident Evil 2 is the best game of the 3, but I have this unstoppable nostalgia for the first one. I even read the local gaming magazine walkthrough multiple times before I got to play it. I played it first in one of my neighbors' houses, and they didn't quite understand how to play it. Of course, I gained the knowledge by reading the guide multiple times. I melted their minds my first time playing it. There is another Resident Evil game on the PlayStation, Resident Evil Survivor. It's a decent little first-person shooter, kind of. Because of its fully real-time 3D nature, it becomes infinitely more playable by running it on emulator at high resolution and with other graphical improvements. I would appreciate it if you like the video and subscribe to my channel for classic video game content like this. Thank you for your support. Some people tolerate sports games, and some don't. I don't mind them, honestly. I'd rather play a sports game of any given sport than the actual sport itself. That's just me though. As a Finn, my preferred sports games are hockey games, and PS1 had a few worth mentioning. The first ice hockey game we played on the PlayStation was Sony's NHL Face-Off before EA Sports had their NHL franchise on the system. Of course, the legendary score announcer from NHL Face-Off 97 is legendary.
Penguins goal! Scored by Mario
I have the physical copy of the original here. After NHL Face-Off and NHL Face-Off 97, EA Sports games started to arrive on the system. When NHL 97 launched on PlayStation in November 1996, it introduced fully 3D hockey games for console and PC players alike. It was a decent enough hockey game, but the next year's NHL 98 was the one that blew the roofs off people's living rooms. It was the most realistic hockey game ever.
He passes. A shot. Vernon stops him.
The games kept coming, but when NHL 99 came, my brother and I played it on PC. Here's the big box. The more recent hockey game I've enjoyed on the PS1 is a port of Midway's arcade hockey game 2-on-2 Open Ice Challenge. It's a fun little arcade hockey game from better days. Of course, a lot of other sports were represented on the system, like EA Sports FIFA games. Some other football games or soccer games, if you prefer, were available, like one of my favorites, Adidas Power Soccer and Actua Soccer.
losing control of this game.
Such a precision about that.
Great goal. Absolutely out of the top ball.
I think that's enough for sports. Welcome back! All 3 of you who didn't leave the video when I started discussing sports games. Platformers have been a mainstay of gaming throughout video game history. Initially they were mainly 2D side-scrolling platformers, but 3D polygons in systems like PS1 made real-time 3D platformers possible. The original PlayStation, a crossroads of 2D and 3D gaming, has more than enough of both variants. First I need to mention the Crash Bandicoot series from Naughty Dog, because it was one of those early platformers on the PlayStation that made some noise. While it was rendered with 3D graphics, the gameplay was still linear. I enjoyed these games, especially the second one, which blew my mind with all the new features and better controls. Crash was also considered Sony PlayStation's so-called mascot, like Mario was for Nintendo and Sonic for Sega. Obviously, Sony didn't have the rights to the IP, and Crash appeared on other consoles going into the next generation. One early fully 3D platformer, and first person at that, was Jumping Flash. I freaking loved it and I can still enjoy it very much. Again, Jumping Flash is one of those games that makes transformational leap in playability when running at high res, and graphics improvements on emulators like DuckStation is utterly playable on real system though. I wouldn't hear the end of it if I didn't mention Spyro the Dragon games here, so here I am mentioning them, even though this is a list of games that made me a PlayStation fan. There were 3 games on the PS1 and they were all good games, I think. I really only played the first one in the 90s. Of course there are many more platformers on the system, but I admit I'm not really into this genre as much as I was when I was younger. Last but not least, there are fighting games. One of my favorite video game genres, even though I'm not very good at them. I just enjoy the presentation, characters, music, etc. The first game I ever played on the original PlayStation was Mortal Kombat 3 in my friend's house, before I even had the system at home. Of course, that game is still a pure 2D affair, and I didn't think much of it. I liked it for what it was, even though I thought finishing moves were lazy compared to the MK2 I had on my Mega Drive.
Sonya wins.
Mortal Kombat Trilogy was an excellent package. I even have it physically. It's not the exact copy I had back then, but a copy of it nonetheless.
Melina wins. Brutality.
So, I read gaming magazines back then, and they hyped the PlayStation as this powerful 3D graphics machine. I asked my friend, do you have any of those 3-dimensional games? He said no, and MK3 was the only full retail game he had at the time, but he had a demo disc, and now the fun started. The Battle Arena Toshinden demo floored me, as did the Tekken 2, which he got a few weeks later. Tekken 2 was my game of choice when we finally got our system home. Tekken 2 and the original Tekken are superior games to Battle Arena Toshinden, but 3D graphics were such a new thing to me back then that they looked the coolest thing ever.
Great.
You win.
It all boils up to PlayStation having the right games at the right time for me. Even though PlayStation won me over big time back in the mid-1990s, it doesn't mean I don't like or enjoy systems like Mega Drive or Super Nintendo, because I do. Or even things like Saturn. It has some amazing games too, like Capcom fighting games. There are fantastic versions of those on Saturn. I just wasn't too keen to play old looking games back then, when 3D graphics were all the rage in the gaming world. Or Nintendo 64. Super Mario 64 is one of the best games ever made. The PlayStation, the PS1 just had so much cool stuff. There's a reason why it won that generation by a wide margin, and the next one by even wider margin. I want to thank you for watching this video. My channel also has some other videos about classic gaming. Click the one on your screen to watch more.